They stood her on a crate beside 2 sacks of dried corn, and said she came free with either. The heat of dusk clung to my coat as I reined in beside the ramshackle auction pen. Dust swirled in peach-colored light, painting the crowd in weary shades of gray. Wagons creaked, mules stamped, and somewhere a harmonica coughed out an off-key tune just enough noise to hide the shame of what was happening on that splintered platform. I'd come to Cedar Crossing for fence wire and salt blocks, nothing more. Yet there she was, a half-starved slip of a girl balanced on weather-warped pine, wrists bound with hemp that bit into skin so pale it near matched the linen shred she wore as a dress. Bare feet trembled on the edge of the crate. Her gaze roamed the faces below but never settled, as if every pair of eyes promised the same verdict: nothing good. A rangy farmer, drunk on red shine, lifted one of the corn sacks and slapped it for emphasis. 2 bushels, oh, last season's sweetest, he slurred. Girl comes with it, call her a bonus. Laughter rolled through the crowd, mean as cactus needles. The auctioneer, a stout man with tobacco stains in his beard, tipped his hat. A fair trade in these lean times, he declared. Who'll top it? No one spoke, not because they lacked coin, but because cruelty cost them nothing. The girl's shoulders twitched. She stared at the ground as though memorizing each mote of dust, trying to vanish between them. I flicked my reins. Could have simply moved on farm chores, waited 10 miles west, and my own pockets felt the pinch of another relentless summer. Yet a voice inside, softer than a prayer and older than my regrets, whispered, if I ride past now, I'll carry this dust on my soul forever. I swung down from the saddle. Spurs chimed. Eyes followed me. The quiet stranger with too many scars for polite company and too little patience for fools. Coins clinked in my palm. Heavy, honest silver earned branding cabs at dawn and burying neighbors at dusk. $10, I said, calm as Sunday Mass. Silver flashed in the crimson light, and the sacks of corn stay with the farmer. A hush rippled over the square. $10 bought a month of provisions, maybe a colt if you bargained hard. It was absurd for a destitute girl, absurd because she should never have been priced at all. The auctioneer swallowed. Sir, you'll insult good folk, implying I'm not buying a girl. My voice cut the air. I'm buying her. Name back, someone spat. Another muttered, bleeding heart rancher. A heavy-set drover shoved forward, whiskey reeking off him. You spoiling our trade, stranger. She's property till the man who won her says otherwise. Then let the man speak, I replied, eyes never leaving the girl. She risked a glance, dark irises wide with disbelief. The drunken farmer blinked, sweat streaking mud on his brow. Greed warred with pride behind his dull gaze. Name's Samuel Briggs, he slurred, puffing his chest. And that little crow owes me chores. $10 is mighty tempting, but I think I'll keep the corn and the girl both. I stepped onto the platform. Timber cracked under my boots. Faces closed in, hunger for spectacle sharpening every jawline. My revolver stayed holstered. They didn't need steel to finish this, only resolve in the weight of watching eyes. I counted out $20, every last coin I'd saved since spring, laid them on the crate beside her bare toes. Double, I said quietly. Enough to plant a fields, if you've the sense. Briggs licked cracked lips. Towns like Cedar Crossing ran on want. Enough silver blinded most men to righteousness. He eyed the crowd, searching for permission, but found only curious silence. Finally he snatched the money, stumbling back with a grin slick as oil. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sold for $20. He tried to sound triumphant, but it came out ashamed. I knelt, sawed through the rope with my pocket knife. The girl's wrists were raw, her pulse fluttering under bruised skin like a sparrow behind glass. She swayed half from hunger, half from nowhere left to stand. What's your name? I asked. She opened her mouth. No sound emerged. Perhaps it had been beaten from her, or maybe she no longer trusted the shape of it. I shrugged off my duster and draped it over her shoulders. The coat swallowed her frame, but warmth blossomed in her eyes, confusion first, then something fragile, as the dawn. Can you walk? I murmured. She nodded. Together we stepped off the crate. The crowd parted, unsure whether to jeer or cheer. Some did both. Anger simmered behind a pair of toughs leaning against the saloon porch, thin-lipped men who'd bet on the farmer's corn and lost entertainment instead. One spat at the dirt as we passed. Ain't over, stranger, he warned. I met his stare until he looked away. The sun dipped lower, smearing blood-red streaks across a sky already bruised by twilight. I helped the girl onto my horse, climbed up behind her, and nudged the gelding toward the open road. When Cedar Crossing shrank behind a curtain of dust, she finally spoke, voice no louder than the wind brushing sage. Why? Because somewhere along the miles between cradle and grave, a man decides what he'll carry in his heart. I'd hold enough regret on my back to know its weight. Because no one trades people for grain, I said. Not while I'm breathing. She turned her head just enough that I could see one careful tear track down her cheek, carving a clean path through the dirt. She wiped it away before the wind could dry it. Then she faced forward, shoulders straightening inside my oversized coat as though it was stitched from something stronger than leather, maybe hope. Behind us, the last of the town's laughter faded. Ahead lay 30 acres of thirsty pasture, a sagging porch that needed paint, and a barn loft where birds nested in the rafters. Hardly paradise, but it was mine to share. Fireflies sparked along the roadside, blinking like distant campfires held in tiny hands. The girl reached out, fingertips grazing the cool night air, as though already claiming what freedom tasted like. I guided the horse west, toward the thin blue ribbon of mountains still glowing from the sun's farewell. With each hoofbeat, the image of her standing on that crate burned deeper into memory. A brand across my conscience. A promise that this ride was only the first mile of a longer journey, one where she would walk on her own feet, speak her name with pride, and never again fear the price someone might place on it. The road home ran straight through windscout prairie, and for the first hour she clutched the saddle horn like it might vanish if she loosened her grip. I kept the mare at a steady trot, letting the miles blur the memory of the auction block. When I pointed to the distant smudge of cottonwoods that marked my land, she only pulled my coat tighter around her thin shoulders. We reached the ranch near midnight. Moonlight spilled over cracked fence rails and the sloping roof of the barn, silvering the wheat stubble that still stood ankle-high after harvest. The house crouched beyond a dry creek bed, windows unlit, chimney cold. I swung down first, offered a hand. She slid off without touching me, landed light, and stepped back. Not a word. I led the horse to the corral, unbuckled the saddle, and whistled softly to settle her. When I turned, the girl was watching, arms folded beneath the coat, eyes dark and wary as a barn owl's. Inside the kitchen I lit a stub of candle and set a loaf of hard bread, a crock of jam, and a tin cup of water on the table. She stood in the doorway, knees locked. "Eat if you're able," I said, and retreated to the porch so she'd have the room to herself. Through the cracked boards I heard nothing, no scrape of chair legs, no clink of tin. After a few minutes she eased, past me still silent, and sat on the top step, staring across the night fields. The bread lay untouched. There are ghosts on any stretch of land where men have bled for it. Mine linger mostly in the orchard, a dozen gnarled apple trees, the drought all but killed. Their branches rattled in the breeze like bones knocking on a coffin lid, reminding me how long it had been since laughter lived here. I could feel her listening to that sound and deciding whether this place was kinder than the last. At dawn I found her in the yard beside a small, smoky fire. The ragged linen dress, the one she'd been sold in, lay across the embers, curling into black lace. She knelt, feeding the flames without expression, as if burning it were part of some ceremony only she understood. When the last scrap fluttered up the wind as ash, she stood, turned away, and wiped her hands on my coat. I showed her the barn loft, where sun warmed the hay even in winter. "You can sleep here until you'd rather not," I said, hanging a clean quilt over the ladder rail. She traced the faded calico squares with her fingertips, not quite touching, then sat cross-legged in the straw. Still, no words. Days bled together. I rose before dawn, milked the lone cow, checked the fence line. She stayed invisible until mid-morning, appearing like a shadow in my periphery, always wrapped in that coat. Always barefoot, though I'd left a pair of old boots on the porch. Meals went cold on the table every time I stepped outside so she could enter. The silence wasn't angry, it was armored. On the fourth morning I found her perched on the henhouse threshold, watching the speckled hens scratch furiously at dirt. I set a wooden bowl of feed beside her. She glanced at me, fingers twitching as though unsure of the offering, then scattered the grain with small, cautious tosses. When the hens clucked approval, something eased in her shoulders. The next day she did it without prompting. I didn't ask her story. Folks carve their hurts into granite once you pry at them. Instead I mended the porch steps while she swept the yard with a willow broom she'd fashioned from fallen branches. I noticed how she kept the broom between us, like a slim wall she could lift if my footsteps drew too near. 2 evenings later I returned from checking the far well and found the barn lantern glowing. She was up in the loft, kneeling by the quilt, folding the spare clothes I'd left, a cotton blouse, work pants, wool socks. She smoothed every crease, treating the fabric as something precious rather than common cloth. The lamp cast soft halos around her hair, turning the dust motes to golden seed. Outside, a coyote yipped, and the horses stamped. I thought she'd freeze, but she kept her back to me, pretending bravery. I stepped onto the ladder rung so she could hear where I stood. "Storm might blow through tonight," I said. "If it troubles you, there's a spare cot by the stove." She did not look around. Only when the loft settled quiet again did I catch the faintest tremor of breath, as if she'd exhaled a secret she hadn't meant to hold. On the 7th sunrise, I found her crouched in the orchard, palms pressed to the gray earth beneath the apple trees. The coat lay folded at the trunk, and she wore the blouse and pants, sleeves too long, cuffs pinned with twine, dew-soaked the knees. She listened to the roots the way some folks listen for hymns. I offered her an enamel mug of coffee. Steam rose between us. She accepted, drinking in tiny sips that left brown crescents on her lips. We stood in easy silence. The orchard smelled faintly of life beneath all that rot. She set the mug on a stump and turned toward me, chin lifted though her voice barely rose above the rustle of wheat. "Why?" It was the first word I'd heard since the night she whispered it on the road, and this time it hung heavier, demanding, "Why bring her here? Why kindness? Why me?" I rested a hand on the rough bark beside us, felt the pulse of old wood still fighting to leaf again, and searched for truth simple enough to keep. "Because no one should be traded for grain," I said at last, meeting her gaze. "Not in a land where we break horses, not people." She studied my face as though measuring the strength of a fence post before leaning her weight against it. Then she nodded once, small but certain, picked up the mug, and finished the coffee. The sun slipped higher, washing the field in gold. And for the first time she didn't flinch when my shoulder brushed hers on the walk back to the house. The night the thunder rolled in, the wind came first, hot and restless, shaking the loose shutters like fingers drumming for entry. She and I were in the barn finishing the evening chores when the first blue flash lit the rafters. She froze, pitchfork in hand, eyes seeking the corners as though the sky might crack open above us. I set aside the lantern and spread a blanket near the tack wall where the hay was driest, motioning her to sit. The mare stamped nervously, sensing whether I spoke low to the horse until her flank settled, then joined the girl on the blanket, our shoulders nearly touching. Lightning split a beam of light through the gaps, bright enough to carve every scar on my knuckles into stark relief. Thunder followed a deep-bellied roar that rattled the stall doors. In that boom, Clara's story broke loose, words tumbling like stones dislodged by rain. She did not look at me. She spoke to the storm. Her mother had died slow the previous winter, fever that left no pennies for burial. A month later, Clara's stepfather came home from the saloon with corn he could not have earned honest, dragging Clara by the wrist. "Debt paid," he'd told the trader. Her voice shook, but not with fear, mostly with disbelief that any of it could have happened. Outside, a sheet of rain clattered on the tin roof, drowning the last of town laughter. Still trapped in her memory, when she finally whispered her name, Clara, it floated between us like a candle flame refusing the wind. I repeated it once, soft, so it wouldn't fade. She tightened her fingers in the blanket and watched my lips as though she'd never heard it spoken kindly. When the storm quieted to a steady hush, we sat there until the lantern burned itself out, the dark barn echoing with the horse's steady breathing and the new weight of her name. Sunrise carried clean ozone across the prairie, sky scrubbed, blue and bright. Clara met me at the corral, wearing my old boots and determination in her stride. I handed her a branding iron and showed her how to angle the tip, how to read a calf's fear and keep steady anyway. She flinched at the hiss that first-time metal-kissed hide, then squared her shoulders and pressed the iron true. By noon she barely trembled. In the tack room I set a half-finished saddlebag on the bench. Thick cowhide dyed the color of wet cedar. Between the stitches I'd carved a single word in looping script, Clara. She traced the letters, calloused, finger clouding the fresh oil sheen. Then she looked at me like someone seeing sunrise from the far side of winter. She threaded the needle, sat beside me, and we finished the seams together, her stitches crooked but determined, mine patient enough to let them be. Days found a gentler rhythm after that. She learned to loop harness leather without kinking it, to whistle the mare calm when storms brewed on the horizon. At dawn we drank tin cups of coffee on the porch rail, steam wreathing our faces while the sky pinked over the wheat. Once, I knocked a pail of fresh milk off the fence. It burst open in a white fountain over my boots. She slapped a hand over her mouth to hide laughter but failed, and the sound burst free, bright, startled, alive. I laughed too, louder than I had in years, and the hens squawked in protest, scattering like gossipers denied the best seat. Evenings we worked at the orchard, trimming dead limbs and binding the survivors with cloth strips. Sap still ran beneath the battered bark. Clara pressed her ear to a trunk and declared she could hear it beat. I believed her without asking proof. The trouble came on a still afternoon when the cicadas were so loud they drowned thought. Dust spiraled on the lane, announcing riders long before their forms took shape. 3 men, shirts half unbuttoned, whiskey confidence in their seat. The farmer Briggs led, flanked by 2 others I'd seen leaning against that saloon porch. They drew up at the gate, horses snorting, and one of them spat into my wheat as if marking it for harvest. Clara was up a ladder tying canvas over ripening apples. She saw them, went pale, and climbed down slow, eyes never leaving the intruders. I stepped from the barn doorway with my Winchester loose in my hand, barrel low but visible. Briggs grinned, wide enough to show gaps in his teeth. "Afternoon rancher, come for what's ours. What you paid for rotted away in the rain," I said. "Take your horses and forget the road back." One of his companions cocked his head at Clara. "Girl owes us service. Law says property returned or paid double. No law within 50 miles would chance calling her that, and no man with sense would either." Briggs laughed, though it cracked at the edges. "You gonna preach her straight?" I lifted the rifle to my shoulder, sight steady on the space between his eyes. The iron felt cool and final. "She's got a name now. You come for her. You answer to it." Clara stood behind me, silent but solid. I could feel her heartbeat in the air. She reached forward, 2 fingers brushing the back of my elbow in a fear. "Just permission granted." Briggs saw the gesture and went rigid, realizing the measure of what lay between us was not coin but covenant. A long moment stretched, wind sliding through the wheat-like whispered verdicts. The second man's hand twitched near his holster. I read it and knew he'd die before the trigger fully rose. Briggs must have seen the same truth in my posture, because he jerked his reins, spit again this time onto his own boot and turned. The other two followed, their bravado leaking into the dust behind them. I kept the rifle raised until the riders were nothing but heat shimmer. Only then did I lower it, thumbed the hammer safely forward, and turned to Clara. She exhaled a breath she'd been saving maybe her whole life. Stepfather to auction block to this very minute. Then she reached out, took the saddlebag from my shoulder, and slipped the strap over hers. The name gleamed in the sun, no longer a promise but a possession. We walked back toward the barn, side by side. The cicadas resumed their chorus overhead, as if danger had merely been a pause between verses, and the orchard beyond, though wounded, rustled with leaves bright enough to believe in next spring. The riders returned at sundown, silhouettes framed by a sky the color of embers. I was pitching hay when the first rifle crack split the air and a splinter of barn door flew past my cheek. I dove behind a wagon tongue, rolled, and came up with my Winchester. Clara's shout carried from the porch, a single sharp warning, before she ducked inside. Another shot rang iron wind off the anvil beside me. I sucked the breath deeper, sighted Briggs atop his bay, and squeezed. His hat sailed that round, tearing through the brim and nicking his ear. He wheeled off balance, cursed and fired. Back, the bullet ripped my upper arm white hot, shallow but numbing, then punched through the wagon spokes with a shriek. Dust rose like ghosts between us. The second rider spurred forward, pistol high, trying to flank the barn. I led him by a heartbeat and dropped him with a round to the shoulder. He toppled into wheat, howling. The third man took the hint, jerking his reins toward the road. Briggs cursed again, blood matting his sideburn, but fear slid into his eyes. I levered another cartridge with deliberate calm and called, "Wind's shifting, Samuel. Smell that? It's turning on you." He spat, yanked his injured friend upright, and thundered off, leaving the wounded to scramble after on foot. Their hoofbeats faded into twilight, swallowed by the prairie's vast hush. Silence rang louder than the rifle. I leaned back against the wagon, the ache in my arm pulsing with each heartbeat. The world narrowed to wheat rustle and the metallic taste of spent powder. Then Clara was there, kneeling, her hands slick with my blood before I felt them. She cut the shirt sleeve away, poured whiskey onto the wound, and wrapped it tight with strips torn from her blouse hem. Her jaw set like flint, but her touch never trembled. When the bandage held, she brushed sweat from my brow and spoke my name for the first time. Elias sounded like a vow spoken to the earth itself. I managed a crooked smile. "Thought you might have guessed by now," I said, trying for lightness. She answered with a look so steady it pinned the spinning horizon. "You gave me mine back. Fair is fair." Rain came gentle 2 days later, the kind that sinks slow and deep. Clara woke me before dawn, pressed a folded packet of apple seeds into my palm, and led me past the orchard's broken row. Together we knelt in soil still dark from stormwater. She dug small impressions with her thumbs, set each seed with deliberate care, and covered them as though tucking children to sleep. "Something should grow from all this," she whispered, patting the last mound. I pressed my uninjured hand over hers, feeling the pulse of tomorrow under our fingers. Summer stretched golden. My arm healed into a stiff scar that ached when storms brewed, but it reminded me I'd stood my ground. Clara worked beside me as daylight demanded, mending harness leather, weeding between barley shoots, singing under her breath while she brushed the mare's coat to a sunset shine. She laughed more freely, voice warming the spaces grief had hollowed. I found her one afternoon atop the porch rail, trying on an old felt hat of mine, brim too wide for her narrow face. She tipped it low, mimicking my slow drawl until we both dissolved into helpless laughter. Come autumn, the ranch smelled of cut grain and wood smoke. The wheat stood tall enough to whisper secrets, and the lean stalks near the creek bowed heavy. With ears of corn, Clara insisted we plant just for spite. We hauled the harvest in wagon loads to town. Folks staring as the girl once traded for grain strode beside me, boots dusted, hat cocked, eyes unflinching. Briggs and his companions were gone. Wood said they'd pushed south after licking their wounds, but the memory of them still tasted of iron and dust. Clara, though, walked taller than any shadow they left behind. The orchard surprised us first. Tiny green knobs swelled on branches we had feared dead, stubborn shoots crowned by clutches of hopeful leaves. One crisp morning Clara plucked the season's inaugural apple, small, mottled, perfect, and held it out to me like an offering. Juice ran down her wrist when I bit. We traded the core back and forth until only seeds and laughter remained. Late that evening, under a sky powdered with cold stars, I rested on the porch while Clara tallied grain sacks by lantern glow. I considered the road from that auction block to this quiet piece of earth, every mile paved with her silence, her question, her name. She finished the count, wiped her hands, and settled beside me, shoulder to shoulder. We watched the wind brush over stubble fields, a silver tide on dark water. She came here with nothing. No name, no kin, no hope. But I watched her reclaim every piece, one sunrise at a time. And when folks ask if she's mine, I just say, she's her own, and that's more than enough.